well? Okay. So I can start. So first of all, I want to give some sort of explanation about standard tests. First of all, they would be true or false, short essay questions like few lines, multiple choices, and similar. Also, on those standardized tests, it's important that we would have hidden identity. There wouldn't be names on them for the people that would mark the test. They wouldn't see the name of the person who did the test. Most of that would be checked by machines, because if they are on circling, check true or false, multiple questions, and etc., they would be marked by machine. In that way, we are eliminating the human factor of possible biases, even if they're not intentional. But because often biases are, even if it's not one-on-one bias made, even if it's not a one-on-one interview, the bias can be made because of the name of the person that is being questioned, and etc. Because once you see the name that is Mohammed Shapir or something like that, the person can see that that person is from, because of some sort of nationality or something like that, from religion and etc., and they can make a bias based on that. So we want to mitigate by this standardized test, we want to mitigate all those biases and discrimination made on purpose or even not on purpose. And because of that, we will prove you that in this way, you will see the real success of the persons, of all candidates that are applying for schools. And in that manner, it won't matter from what person from where are you coming from, who are your parents, how much they earn, and etc. So in this way, we are removing all those biases and discrimination that do exist in examining the applications. So all those tests will be constructed from the since the persons that will construct the tests won't know who all of them will be answering those questions. It will be constructed from the persons that are experts in their fields and etc. And there will be broad questions, detailed questions that are specifically made for that profession, for that branch of, I don't know, chemistry, physics, and etc. In that way, it won't be able to, the interviews won't be able to ask questions that on purposely will somehow eliminate that candidate from applying for that school and etc., because the interviewer maybe didn't like the person because it's a woman, or maybe because it's a person of color, minority, and etc. Thanks. If you have individual tests, those interviews and etc., even if someone is the best, even if someone knows everything, the interviewer always can ask questions that can bomb you and that can eliminate you from the race for applying for that school. It's always everything depends on that interviewer and on his bias and discrimination, if it has that. And even if there's no bias or discrimination, it can depend on the mood of that person that day, or because he had already questions, tens and tens of persons before you, and you're the last one for that day, and he's sick of everything. And in the end, because of this, the people, the kids of some powerful man or some rich families and etc. won't be able to be questioned only for on the basis of the most easy questions and etc. And with this individual tests. There are no checks and balances if that person is really adapt for that school. Everything depends on the interviewer, and if that person got questions on the right questions for that day. With the on the standardized test, in this sort of questions, you know that what to expect. You know how to prepare for them. You know that everything depends on you, and because of that, it's easier to prepare for something like that mentally and academically, even if they are harder, even if they are maybe harder on paper to resolve. Before that, any questions? Okay, so on the interview, you can get questions on to personal questions, or you can be put out outside of your balance because of some, I don't know, if a male asks a woman if she plans to have, does she have plans on having children or something like that. That did happen in that sort of interviews. It can throw you off your balance, and you can, even after that, you can all the interview can go bad after that. But when you have standardized testing, as we proposed, you don't have that variable, those biases, those discrimination, and that variables of the persons that are interviewing you, and they cannot throw you off balance. You have your paper, those answers will be checked without knowing who answered them, and that is the main point of this, to get rid of all of that discrimination that we can see that is happening all around universities. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I call on the leader for the opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, so what I will be doing in my speech is first of all telling you why this system of only using standardized tests is inherently worse, and it harms deserving students, but it also harms universities and the overall educational system as a whole. I will be going into a bit of rebuttal from what was said, and then I'll be going into our own case, showing you why a holistic approach has been proved to be already successful and gives the chances to those who cannot make it by standardized admissions testing. So first of all, points that were brought forth. There was something about like no possible biases, seeing real success. I will have a whole case on how the bias is actually extreme in these standardized tests and why it's nearly impossible for a lot of kids that actually deserve to not be able to score very high on these standardized tests, thus not be able to enter any good universities. Second of all, there were this model of detailed questions for given professions. We think that there are multiple flaws in this. First of all, there's a lot of universities, such as especially in the US, where a lot of like bright kids from all around the world go to, but also like Canada and other countries where you're not even required to declare a major until well half into your degree. Or second of all, there's no right answer in a lot of subjects. For example, you cannot ask someone theoretical questions about art specifically, let's say, or philosophy questions. You might have some like essay questions might be a bit more smart of an answer because there's no one specific like right answer. Other thing that was said were that there's bias from the interviewer, as we see, like it's not just interviewing, it's also essay. And in the current status quo, what the motion, at least how I understand it, is that there would be a combination of everything, like essays and alumni interviews, etc. So like non-quantitative methods. And UA, I will take you in maybe a minute. And then there was something about like there can be difficult questions, for example, asking you if you want to have a family. We think that this is not exactly that. This doesn't fall under something that can be done due to the fact that you will literally you will be able to report these people if they ask you anything sexist, if they ask you anything that makes you uncomfortable, because most universities already offer you like that that possibility. So onto our case, why do we think this is a problem? First, standardized testing, whatever it is, it always limits you to one type of intelligence, and it always limits you to certain kind of knowledge. We think that these tests do not measure your smart, like how smart you are, your abilities, your talent, or how good of a fit you are for a university. It rather measures how good you are at taking that certain test. Why do we think this is wrong? Well, for many reasons. It's a cookie cutter solution, which obviously puts so many people at disadvantage. First of all, I will be talking how our first argument is about how standardized tests such as the SAT, ACT, or maybe subject tests are not a measure of intelligence. And this I will explain why. First of all, there are kids who are just inherently better off at test taking than others. There are some people who will get stressed out and think my whole future depends on this one exam, and they will feel as if their biggest stress of their life is happening right now, thus perform badly. First of all. Second of all, math and reading are like the most common types of standardized tests are like math and reading. But even if we take, for example, just chemistry, are not exactly necessary for some majors, or not. For example, if you go in with a chemistry standardized test and then later on you decide you want to major in philosophy, then basically what got you into this university is completely irrelevant to your success at university, which we think is very arbitrary and very unnecessary. It's basically like something that has no impact in your life afterwards whatsoever. So it should not be a determining factor whether you get a good future or not. And next, like, there are people who can study for these tests. Like, even if you're not good at math and then you want to major in math, there are math 101 courses at university. So everything that's tested on this exam is actually learnable if you show that you are a talent, if you show that, for example, if you want to study science, but you don't do very well in the science subject test, you might have had lab experience. You might have show that you have extreme passion. It's just that you weren't given the chance to study this certain material. So this brings us to the second point. There's disproportionate discrimination within these tests, and this has been proven times on and on. If we look at the US, one of the biggest examples where standardized tests dictate, PO, I'll take you before my time is up.
Look, what is it about inherently this testing? This testing in terms of the vocabulary and the way these questions are asked are going to be consistently scrutinized by 35, like for the entire population with things like statistical tests. Why is it inherently discriminatory?
It's inherently discriminatory because of the fact that some people get purposefully, specifically taught, they get professional mentors, they get specialized schools where they get taught this. For example, if you have a kid in Manhattan who comes from a very high-off family, they of course can afford a private tutor from the best universities, for example, from Harvard, who will teach them how to do the SAT from when they're 15. So obviously we have this kid who has for 3-4 years before they take the test for specifically how to answer these questions. And then you have a kid who comes from a poor neighborhood, maybe, who has gone to a lower quality school where they don't get the equal education, which immediately puts them on a not same level playing field. And obviously, if they come from a poor neighborhood, they cannot afford this specialized tutoring, which means that they are already so much behind the other kid. So even if they're a talented kid, even if they're so smart in the subject, maybe they don't learn the specifics of how to take the test and they will do worse. So what we're saying is that this disproportionate discrimination makes it so that a lot of these minorities, a lot of these like most vulnerable people of our societies will be worse off due to the fact that they will continue being in that cycle of poverty because they will not be able to get a good education after their low quality high school education, just due to the fact that they will not be able to perform well. Having essays, having interviews will give the chance to an alumni or someone who reads these essays to see that maybe there's something else, maybe there's potential. This kid maybe has gotten 70% score on the SAT or on the whatever standardized score. However, they are talented in this subject, they're a talented artist, they're a good scientist, they've done so much for their environment and community. And we just think that the impact of this is that we will give those most vulnerable the chance to succeed. We think this is very highly important. And due to the fact that I showed you, first of all, as the standardized tests are not a measure of good measure of intelligence, fit, and talent. And second of all, that disproportionate discrimination is at an all-time high due to the fact that there's so many factors. We believe that you should support opposition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I call on the Deputy Prime Minister.
Just a second, please. Okay, may I? Okay, so basically this debate all comes down towards students, right? How we will get a fair system for students, how we'll take away some pressure from the students, and how at the end of the day we'll stop discrimination, right? So I think that the thing in this debate it gives the most fair results, and which at the end of the day stops and fights against discrimination at the very best, is the thing which is in this debate, and so far it has been an OG, right? And everything we have done so far, everything we've done throughout our model, which basically eliminates the entire, or not entire, but as much of human factor as possible, is something that's terrific. But before I start on with the way this system of non-standardized testing is simply a mechanism for privileged class of people to remain privileged, I'll give you a few points of revival. Right? So when it comes to when it comes to this point of panic, right, where students will feel a certain panic when he goes to testing, yeah, I think that's true, right? But we don't see how is that different towards an interview, right? Because if you give me a point that standardized, that kids may feel pressure from tests, while on the other hand, they've been doing tests for the last 15 years, while on the other hand, most of the kids have never done any single interview throughout their life. Now, all of a sudden, they will go calm towards that interview. No, they won't, right? They'll feel even more pressure, they feel even more nervousness going towards interviews. And it's much easier to fail in the interview, right? You can go on and having some sort of fear of public performance, have a stutter that day, think that you look bad, not being able to sleep or something like that. You go on, make yourself sound like an idiot, and you end up not feeling so intelligent, not being so smart, and failing, while on the other hand, you are quite all right? So that's the first problem, right? So even though the panic exists in all cases, we think that interview is far more stressful. On the other hand, the thing is, even if we acknowledge that same level of nervousness exists, you still have to accept the fact that at least in our world, you are simply a number, right? Which basically means that you do not have a race, you do not have a gender, you do not have a religion, you do not have anything, right, other than your knowledge. But on the interview, if you approach the interview and all of a sudden your name is, for your approaching interview, some conservative university in the European country, which basically has a small percentage of, let's say, Muslim population, your name is Muhammad, you really think that will have the same chance as some candidate. No, we will be discriminated based on that fact. While on the other hand, if you end up and if you are being simply a simple number, it doesn't matter what's your name, right? So even if we accept your case of some people not being good at tests, we still think that all of those vulnerable groups in our society, right, minorities, religious, and so on, who have been facing discrimination throughout their entire life, will be far better off if their faces are unknown, if their names are unknown, if they're simply numbered, if everything that exists is them and they're not, right? So I think that is a majority of pressure for them. The second point was certain things about users and so on. Well, basically, how is that different from non-standardized testing, right? The difference exists in simple matter. When you have standardized tests for, let's say, the last 5 years, you buy a book which will have all of the previous questions which have been on those tests for the last 5 years. Even if there is no book, those questions will be online, right? You will be able to download them. You will be able to prepare for those kind of tests. While on the other hand, if you only have an interview or an essay, God knows how can you prepare. The only way you can prepare for that kind of an interview is if you know something, if you want to go to Harvard, let's say, the easiest way for you to go to Harvard and to get throughout the Harvard interview is to find someone who has been at Harvard, right? And he will be expensive, which once again proves that non-standardized testing is rather right for privileged class of people, because at this kind of scenario, what will happen is someone will can you hear me? Can someone confirm that you can hear me?
I can, yes.
Yes, thank you. So basically, the thing is rather simple. If you have non-standardized tests, you will find a tutor who has been at Harvard, who is rather expensive, who is once again not available and won't be there for less privileged kids, for poor kids, and who will go on and tell you, well, look, this guy will interview. His favorite football team is this. He likes this kind of ideology. He votes like this. And if you're a woman, he might give you an advice. Put on a miniskirt, right? And I don't think a single woman wants to be exposed to something like that, right? I think that at that scenario, it's much better to remain a number, to remain hidden. The thing is, non-standardized test is a fancy word which allows a privileged class to remain privileged. You go on to a fancy high school, you go on to an interview, and you have an interviewer who tells you, oh, you've been to fancy private school. I've been there as well, right? So that's fancy school. You must be well-educated. Well, we'll find a room for you, right? Even though that's kid who went throughout the high school and who basically smoked weed and snorted coke throughout his high school, basically is a simple rich privileged prick who knows basically nothing and has no decent education. But on the other hand, if you have a kid who came from a public school, what he wants is display his knowledge. What he wants to do is quite simply, look, I went to the public school and this is what I've learned. This is my knowledge. This is what I have behind me. And that kid will have much more of a chance to display his knowledge. Why? Well, because of the standards, because of the standardized question, he knows what is going to be there for him. He knows precisely what kind of questions he is going to be asked. He knows that, okay, this have been the questions throughout the last 5 years. I need to prepare in such a manner. So we think that that kid is going to excel. He won't be needing tutors. He won't be needing previous examples and previous knowledge from those big schools. While on the other hand, if you have a rich kid who basically did nothing throughout his high school, but has still been in a rather fancy high school, he in this kind of scenario will have much better off, right? So we acknowledge that this system is not perfect. But we also acknowledge that this is the only system which efficiently fights discrimination, which fights discrimination in such a manner that basically your race, your gender, nothing matters besides your knowledge, and you have higher chances of obtaining your knowledge due to the fact that everything is standardized and you can get the experience from previous years. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I was having at first some issues hearing, but what I did is I turned the video off and I could hear like much better. So if anyone is having like issues hearing, I would recommend that you try turning the camera off. I think for some reason it distorts audio. Okay, so now I would like to call the DLO.
Just a second. As the second speaker of the opening opposition, I will structure my speech in the following manner. First of all, I will identify which stakeholders are the most important one and which should we care about. What is the key metric that originates from that? What is our burden of proof and how will we win this debate? Then I will provide also our arguments, deeper analysis of the provided arguments and new arguments, which is that universities and students can find a better fit in our world than in their world, and also that there is a low correlation between the standardized tests and actual academic success and later career success. And we are saying that over-relying on those standardized tests, therefore, is not a good way to assess students and to help them realize their potential. Then I will also provide some rebuttals on the what opening government brought to us. So stakeholders in our debate, which we think are the most important one, is members of minorities and people that were deprivileged in the beginning of their life, so in the years before the university. Other stakeholders are also students, university, and society as a whole, and I will show how each of those stakeholders benefits in our system. So if we show that both students and universities are better off, we win this debate. And we say that key metric is finding good fit for students and universities. So and we will show that even if we take fairness, which is in their system, the key metric, we still win this debate. So first of all, we want to clarify that subjectivity per se is not negative. We are saying that in this current system in which playing field is not leveled, we are saying that removing human factor is not a solution, because the problem lies in the system, in the way the systems are compiled, not in necessarily in the human factor in the interviews and essays in which people can affect your chances of getting admitted into university. So we are saying, first of all, I would like to respond to the fact that, to the argument that people are inherently biased, that they will be racist, for example, they will be sexist in conducting interviews and how they will read the essays. We are saying that people get trained to overcome these barriers, but at the same time, we are saying that also this is the only way for them to kind of display affirmative action to understand their students more broadly and in a better way. So for example, you are not only having the tests, you're not only having the score from the standardized test, but you also have the students explaining to you the unique situations they were going through. Why did they not maybe perform well on the test? Why were that like given all the opportunities in the past years to compete with other more privileged, richer students that were having private tutors, that were having additional lectures on how to do this test. So we are saying is that, as my first speaker mentioned, that you get a chance for those people to get the chance that they deserve to break up the poverty cycle they're entrapped with, because they're given this chance and they are not just punished for not being able to prepare for that test accurately. So what we are saying is our system is better because it actually assesses potential rather than just knowledge you already have. Because knowledge, you can always gain knowledge, but you cannot gain necessarily potential or some mindset you have or some desires, passion you have for the university and for the program. So also I would like to respond that even if you have to make tests by topic, some areas are not testable in that way. There is no right answers. It's about your expression, about your thoughts, about your experiences. And we believe that people from minorities, people that experience hardship are more likely to have potential and to bring up unique and very interesting artworks and contribute to those fields. So my first argument, finding a better fit. All universities have a certain culture. They have a certain set of skills that they want for students to have, that they have certain attitudes they want students to fit in good. And we are saying is that through interviews and essays, they get to know students well, and they can assess whether they are a good fit or not. And also this starts the building of a relationship between a student and university. There is more personal relationship between the university and a student, because you actually come in contact with people from the university, you actually talk to them, you can ask questions, and you can see whether this is a good fit, and you can see what are the things they value. While on standardized tests, you are not sure whether you maybe would better fit, but you don't are given a chance to experience that. So university wants a diverse student body, people who will be devoted to the community, and they can only get that through getting to know their students. So what we are claiming is that through interviews and essays, they're finding better fit, and they're creating an environment in which those students will be actually able to grow and in which they will be able to realize their potential. This goes to a second argument of low correlation between standardized tests and later academic success and career success. Because if we then rely only on those tests to predict how students will do well in those universities and later in life, which is in universities' goal to help students and to provide them with what they need, then we cannot really do this effectively if we are having this test that does not predict that or does not correlate with that. So what we are saying is that it's better for university to see some personal opinions of those students that are applying, of some things that they experience, and based on that assess how will they fit in, how will they actually consume knowledge, and what will they do with the knowledge that they already have, and how can they gain new one. So now I will provide some rebuttals. So they said that in interviews are inherently disproportionately affecting negatively minorities because you cannot prepare for it, because you cannot know some personal things about the people that are interviewing. We're saying that not the most important thing is just for the interviewer to like you necessarily, but to like you in the areas in which you show your competence or in which you show your passion for the field you are pursuing. So even if you know their favorite football team, that does not guarantee you advancing to the university. And also we are saying that being yourself, this act of being hard to prepare for minorities is actually advantageous to them, because they can actually show who they are and they can explain their story, and they can be heard in a system in which they are not currently heard and do not have opportunity to overcome obstacles that they've been given with their birth lottery, but they can actually overcome them because people understand them, people want to understand them. And also it is far more fair to test potential rather than specific knowledge that can be later gained. So what we've shown to you is that minorities are better off because they're a given chance, they are understood, they want to be, the universities want to include them because they see that they are a good fit, they see that they have a potential, and they know that by diverse community, they can benefit. Also, the students are better off because they know that they are assessed also more holistically, not just on the knowledge they have or they were given. So they also know for more sure that they will be better functioning at that university because they know what university stands for. Also, universities are better off because they actually get students that they will function properly in their communities and their communities can grow. And also society as a whole is better because if you are in a community which you fit, and you are in a community that understands you, that has a very personal relationship with you, not just through standardized test scores, then you can be better off by realizing your potential and then benefiting to society later on. So we've shown you how it is more fair, our system, because it levels the playing field to some extent and allows affirmative action. And we've also shown you how it's better for the universities to find students that actually will fit in. So because of that, we probably oppose. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I call on the member for government.
Cool. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Then, all right. Then I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. Honorable panel, please note how little structural analysis was happening on opening tables. Mostly what they were talking about were assertions. What I'll do in my case is pretty simple. I'll explain to you why we have higher equality in access to university education systemically, and we'll introduce actual mechanisms that will showcase you. First, why essays and interviews are bad predictors and are used in bad ways by universities due to those systematic reasons. And secondly, why we improve confidence of students in testing and why it's more likely that more people have access to university education through it, right? It was just one point of refutation, right? So opening opposition says that there's a local relation between academic success and standardized testing, but they don't really ever explain as to why essays or interviews are something that is able to predict your later success in any way, right? And not even given that, we believe that standardized tests at least show you a couple things, right? They show that you know the key material that is needed for you to pass this test. And it showcases the fact that you have the discipline for you to study and outcompete other students that are all competing on same equal grounds with you on that same test, which means that you have at least some degree of potential to have actually good performance there, right? Then let us please just go into characterization of how essays are used by universities, right? Within status quo unfairly benefits certain groups and most usually people in good socioeconomic standing, ethnic majorities, etc. because of a few key reasons. A, because of the fact that at the moment, you must usually have a commission of 5 to 10 people, tenured professors in universities that do look through thousands and thousands of essays that are coming into their place. And therefore, that means that they don't actually have that much time to read into each essay, evaluate the character of every person that is writing them in depth in the way as opening opposition is explaining that. Instead of that, they look for tropes that support their perception of a good student, which means that 3 key problems come in. A, we believe that's exactly the reason why bias comes in. It's not necessarily true that all academics are racist by default, but it's true that when you have only like 20 to 30 seconds to look at a CV before deciding whether you should look further into it or throw it out, that means that you have to look out for just a few distinct things, which then most usually are things that are something that are personally appealing to you, which means that when most usually as a tenured professor, which is a hard to achieve position, means that you are a person of privileged, coming from a privileged background, is something that is going to be appealing to you personally. It's more likely that those things that people of your socioeconomic background experience are going to be those, right? Secondly, we believe a lot of randomness just generally comes in as some tropes such as being bold, daring, whatever other things that usually are told for you as something that's good in your motivational essays go over other ones, right? Which means that it screws over people from different like cultural backgrounds that, for example, like Asian people who don't necessarily have to be bold and daring as it's something that is emphasized by those essays, but it also like just means that a lot of things such as spirit and legacy that are out of your control because of your environment are something that is being considered and therefore screws over again people massively on a random basis. Lastly, we believe just language itself that is prevalent in interviews and essays is something that disproportionately screws over people that do tend, due to again their cultural reasons, to speak using a lot of slang and etc., say like Black Americans, etc., which again makes them disadvantaged. With all of that is extremely important when your motivational essay decide whether the rest of your CV is even going to be looked upon or is just going to be thrown away, at which point your GPA, your grades, your other results that you can showcase are not even going to be looked upon. We believe it's extremely important and happening extremely badly in the status quo. What we believe happens in case this motion applies, right? In alternative world, we believe that it's likely that schools will have high incentives to have their kids prepared to those standardized tests and provide them with at least, right, materials for those tests, like prep books, like sample tests, etc. things, or like B, extra classes, tips, tricks, etc. to teach them, because schools probably have a high incentives to have high post-graduation enrollment rates, which means that it reduces inequality massively, as we believe that unlike essays and interviews, tests are actually something that you can reliably prepare upon because of three key reasons. A, because it's not dependent on you having a good background, good story, etc. If you study good, that means you're probably going to get a good result, because overall, over a large period of time, you can study to most of the questions that are in those standard essays, right? B, because it's something that you can easily scale, right? You don't have to work with individual teachers to work out your individual quirks of your language, your individual story to be the most heartbreaking, etc. It is something that is, you can teach everyone how to do maths well, how to like, I don't know, teach vocabulary to everyone to a big class, which means that again, underfunded schools have more opportunities to do so, right? Lastly, we believe it's most importantly, it is something that also allows people to track their progress constantly, right? Because that means that you can actually evaluate whether you are doing well or you should study more in this way and other way, whether you are actually doing well or should study more, which means that it's something that firstly allows you to prepare to those things in a more reliable way. As with an essay, you have only one shot, right? You submit your essay, whether it's liked or not is decided at this point. But with those things, you can actually have an understanding of where you stand. We believe all of those things are important, but before I'll explain why, I'll take opening.
Thank you. So my question is, we explained very well why underfunded schools are not even being taught the basic stuff and they have very, very low quality education. Why do you think that they would specifically teach you for something prep like for a standardized test and give you the materials if they don't have funds?
Okay, I see. Look, even if you're underfunded, you can afford to buy a few books, right? But we believe that's even not a problem, right? Even if you are not affording you to buy yourself a few books, every person can go to the internet and find out materials to prepare to standardized tests, which is available to everyone all the time because everyone is connected to internet in the 21st century, which is something that is not true for case with in preparing to interviews with you actually have to hire someone to talk with, etc., which also reduces inequality, right? Then two reasons as to why you should care about that. First, because you obviously just get a more fair system that minimizes structural bias in educational system, which means that a lot of people that are systematically like being screwed over all the time are not screwed anymore. But secondly, because we believe it enables disadvantaged people to just generally at least try to apply. In status quo, your family gets screwed over an essay, right? Admission fees to universities are pretty high in US. It's like up in hundreds of dollars, which means that opportunity cost for you to go and maybe get screwed over is pretty high. And it's something that many poor people or ethnic minorities decide just not to choose because of the fact how high the costs are. Comparatively, you can actually now track your progress, see that you're doing better from sample test to sample test, believe in yourself and understand that you actually have a shot, which means that you're more likely to try and study hard as you see the potential in yourself, and be just later on apply, and instead of just not doing that as many Black people or like other disadvantaged group are doing at the moment. Our world is by far better for closing government.
Thank you very much. Now I call on the member for the opposition.
Dear panel, can you hear me? If so, perfect.
Yes.
So,
yes.
Even if non-standardized testing is not perfect right now, due to the fact that political accountability is present on that side of the house, it will be in the future, while standardized testing will suffers and will suffer under the curse of a shadow education system in which the wealthiest profit of their wealth to get access to the best colleges. So what do we mean with political accountability? What is the narrative on the standardized testing if it turns out that minorities massively get into worse colleges, whilst the wealthiest tend to get into the better colleges? Well, the narrative will simply be they completed the test, which assesses their competence, which has and will be the narrative that the companies that make these tests provide, but also the government as a whole. And as such, we'll think that they have a legitimate reason for making this kind of biased decisions towards their students. Whilst under a non-standardized testing procedure, it's very much different. OO tends to say, well, affirmative action is an option. We think it's much stronger than that, and we make a crucial extension here. We think it will be expected. We think that universities will be expected to take into account that minorities have lesser opportunities to prep themselves for standardized testing, which means that at the moment they massively disallow minorities to get into certain programs. They will be held accountable by A, the government, by B, their benefactors, and by C, by external students associations. So, what do I mean with, to clarify this? This is, for example, seen in the China-Harvard debacle, in which the groups of Chinese students forced Harvard to give insights into its process and managed to show that they misused their testing procedures in a discriminatory way. And we think that this is a crucial distinction because it is a non-standardized testing procedure and universities still need to be accountable. It's now possible for all to see whether affirmative action is actually being applied. As such, we think, and we are convinced that the expectation will be for these unis to take affirmative action into account. Note that this is the very rational choice also on behalf of the universities. At the moment, there's non-standardized testing, given that being non-biased, or at least being in favor of affirmative actions, will yield more benefactors, will yield to a better reputation, especially in a time of increasing political scrutiny towards unis that discriminate against their students. Having said that, I want to give some rebuttal to the case of CG. So firstly, they say, well, non-standardized testing isn't perfect either. Sure, that's the case. We think that there are some issues present, but we think, especially given that there is this scrutiny, given that universities have to give insight in the way they select students, it will be very much unacceptable for them to skim over every single essay. We think resources can and will be skilled to ensure that universities can, under that scrutiny, actually show that they have made the right decision, that they have made decisions that they can justify to not only their staff, but also to the public as a whole. So again, we think it's irrelevant whether non-standardized testing is perfect right now. We think it will be on the political force exerted. So why is the SAT and standardized testing more generally then so imperfect? We had a rather unnuanced case by CG that, well, all schools have prep material. Yes, but the quality of prep material widely diverges. We think that given that standardized testing has become so important and still needs to distinguish sufficiently between students, it has become rather complicated. And as such, also the quality of the prep material matters rather a lot. Whether you have a completely automated program, which uses machine learning to see which subjects you do well in, which specific subsections of the test you do poorly in. We think that at the moment these things exist and that there are price differences. This will inevitably worsen the situation of those in lesser schools. We think simply that there will be a shadow education system in which the wealthiest pay for the better quality material. So why do we then think that this is comparatively less under non-standardized testing? Well, again, A, given that affirmative action is expected, these differences in class and in wealth can be taken into account and are expected to be taken into account, because otherwise it will be in the media as a whole scrutinized as discriminatory, or to at least not taking into account the injustices and structural discrimination present in the society as a whole. Furthermore, we think that simply given that it's non-standardized testing, that's far harder to prepare in a way that is exclusive to the wealthiest. We think that in interviews, you as a minority person can actually also guide the interview to an extent, show why you are unique, show which elements of discrimination you have overcome. Yes to CG.
So if you go to Google and write in SAT preparation material PDF, you'll find a ton of websites that provide you free prep material. And people do that, you know.
Please quiet. Yes, no, as I said, simply saying there's prep material is not sufficient in this case. The SAT in the US has a lot of prep material, but the quality diverges widely, and that quality directly affects the way in which you can actually perform on that test. At the moment, you have a very simple prep that does not go into the principles, that does not go into an extensive feedback loop as to which things you need to train, which things you need to grind. You will not perform as well as someone that goes to a higher quality school, which has a fully integrated program. I think this should not be explained, given that there's so much demand for schools. The oligopolist nature of this market just allows firms to diversify their products to high-class schools, lower-class schools, and everything in between in such a manner that quality differs widely. Are there more things I need to say? Yeah, just to reiterate, we think that non-standardized testing uniquely forces schools to give an insight into the choices they have made, and as such, if there's a lack of affirmative action, they can be well, scrutinized for that. And also it immediately addresses the case of conscious bias, conscious discrimination, rather than unconscious. So we think this is massively valuable. How much time do I have left, if I can ask?
You're over the time.
I'm over the time. Oh, okay, in that case, I thank you for your attention, and please vote CO. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I call on the government whip.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes.
Cool. All right, let me take my timer. Just a sec. Sorry. All right, here we go. 3, 2, 1. The problem with minority access to university education is not in the fact that it's mostly and consistently discriminatory. The biggest problem of minority access is that these minorities don't even try, because they're consistently told that they're not worth getting education. They're consistently told that this education will not bring the good for them. They consistently shut out of the door of major institutions because they don't look like Ivy League material. The problem is even worse at the point in which there is a huge element of subjectivity, because this element of subjectivity differently affects the way how most people perceive the university education. Mukhtar uniquely explained to you why having standardized education gives these minorities an ability to track their own success, to see what the problems are in their access to education, and to be confident in their ability to access that education. At the point in which this is true, we think that this is the most important impact in this debate. 3 things that I'm going to do in the speech. First, I'm going to rebuild and respond to closing ops. Secondly, I'm going to talk about quality of applicants. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about diversity. Firstly, what do the closing ops say? Closing ops says, look, there's different kinds of educational material. We think few responses. Firstly, is that this is unresponsive inherently to the material that Mukhtar brought you. The reason why standardized materials is different is because they're like with things like internet is that like you have huge number of companies who actually have incentives to provide low-cost material. Why? Because any additional student who is practicing through online material doesn't cost anything to these kinds of companies, because like these, you don't have to print any more books for these people. They simply are joining your course that you already built. You can spend more time on actually the quality of the course rather than tailoring that specifically to individuals. This means that you have things like Magoosh that are sold for like $45, $60. There are a huge number of companies that do that. Closing up says, well, you don't have feedback loops and you don't have an ability to look at the specific of your problem. We think that it is more likely that these kinds of companies want to position themselves as being able to as allowing for diversity, etc., because they want to be perceived as legitimate, because they want to be able to reach out. They're likely to have things like we're working on specific areas of your SAT, whether you're failing at math, whether you're failing at one specific aspect of math. We think that this is what these companies do, and these companies are likely to have like financial aid programs because they want to be not seen as predatory companies that do this kind of stuff. We think that that is likely to happen for these companies, and this is something that is already happening. But even if that wasn't true, on the comparison, we think that it's still better because at least it is perceived as something that these individuals can actually be successful, because they can constantly track their progress, because they can see their performance is improving. This is something that you don't have on your side of the house, at the point in which individuals don't simply know if their essay is good or not. This is just comparatively still the effects stand. Firstly, on the quality of applicants, and here's like the main points of opening opposition. The problem of opening opposition says that tests are limited to a specific subject, therefore they're bad. 3 responses to that. Firstly, we think that there are likely to be multiple different tests. We think that there are, like in Britain, there are different A-level tests you're taking. In the US, reading, math, and different subject tests. They test different things, like math tests your problem-solving skills, reading comprehension is completely different. Things like vocabulary are completely like different parts of your brain and test different types of skills. We think that it's not likely that they are just testing one ability to do tests. Secondly, even if that was true, say they are, what is the comparative? The comparative is they're still going to take they're still going to read your essay and then look at your university grades. To the extent to which university admissions is still things like high school still rely on things like exams, etc. And if you consistently fail on those exams, the comparative is that maybe the quality does go a bit further than that in terms of assessment, but we think that it is still a huge part of the ability of you to perform well on the exams. Thirdly, we can test the fact that really these tests are not testing important things. Mukhtar told you that they test things like level of dedication, the fact that you consistently want to practice certain material. It tests your levels of patience. It tests your ability to look critically at your mistakes, because if you don't look critically at your mistakes, you're not going to succeed in those things. Thirdly, test your ability to manage time, because you have to do well at this test in a span of 2 years and get better at this. To the extent to which opening opposition says that people change majors and it is important to get people to have universal meta skills, we think we achieve that better on our side of the house, because tests allow for these types of skills to develop and select for candidates that are important. What this means is that you don't have a significant decrease in the quality of applicants. We think that this is not an important clash in this debate, and at best we even win this clash to a significant extent. Opening disagrees. I'll take a PI.
Don't you think people will be more motivated and have more hope in the system if they're given a chance to tell their story and explain themselves, rather than to believe in the system scores that has treated them unjustly in the past? How to trust the system with SATs?
Yeah, that is contingent on the fact that these people perceive these people as good-meaning people that are likely to not screw them over, right? Like, to the extent that you don't explain why universities are likely to be systematically anti-racist and good, those kind of benefits don't go on your side. Secondly, moving to diversity, this is the main clash in this debate. Opening government says that they might have a bad mood, that they might have overt biases. Opening op says, no, actually, these people read their stories and want to support these people. Look. And it's not clear whether universities are really bad or not. We uniquely break this deadlock because we take the op at their best. Yes, universities are well-meaning. Yes, committees are probably good and are not want to consistently screw over Black people. But because of systemic reasons, such as limited number of time, closing op says, well, you are going to read through every university. No, you're not going to have 12-person committee reading 100,000 applications, and this is what Harvard received. And even if it's 100, you still don't get huge number of people reading those essays, because those things are inherently vague. Things like, what is your personality? What is your boldness? What is like, what is your achievement? What is your life story? These things are inherently vague. You have limited time on this. This means that you consistently prioritize personality traits that screw over minorities and screw over people with specific personalities. People look for Harvard material, and what they mean by Harvard material is people who can, for example, criticize basic institutions. And this is not something that a lot of different cultures prioritize. In a lot of Confucianist culture, it's something that is not like seen as good to criticize like people that are below you on hierarchy, and you prioritize things that consistently screw different cultures. This is why Asian applicants are seen as being more docile than applicants who are white. You consistently screw up poor people who have different work ethic, who are told by capitalist system that they have to consistently work hard, and they maybe don't have a specific aesthetic appreciation of the world around them that you look for in candidates, even if you are well-meaning and even if you're not racist. The kind of language that you use differently, these are the things that consistently screw over minority applicants. Because these minority applicants know that they are being screwed over, they don't get into the universities, you don't have access. Very proud to propose.
Thank you very much. Now I call on the opposition whip.
Okay, thank you. So first I will respond to some of the stuff brought forth by the closing government, and then I will put forth and reiterate our own case, evaluating it at the sort of broader prospect, comparing it to every side. So what we essentially get from the government whip is this idea that, you know, this training and stuff is pretty much equal, right? Everybody has access to the internet, and it's only like 45, 60 bucks for like a really good course, right? Note that this already puts this training out of reach for many people of like low income households, right? This is like proving our point specifically. We also think that simply having a private tutor is far better than any online material can ever be, right? A tutor can explain things in multiple ways. They can make it more explicit for someone if that's necessary for them to understand it, right? And so this is actually exacerbating the differences between, first of all, people with high education parents and people with low education parents, as higher educated parents tend to emphasize education far more than lower education parents do. Which is logical because these high education parents have seen the benefits that education brings, right? Which the low education households don't necessarily notice. So this is, first of all, a big difference. And then second of all, sort of the ability to spend money is widely different across high income households and low income households. So as we see that education and income are correlated, we can see a massive difference between low income, low education households and the people that are like children of that household versus people that are children of high education, high income parents. So, and then they explain how like all universities are well intended. Note that our case is the only case that systematically explains how universities are actually held to account in improving their eligibility process, right? So then sort of the opening government. So what is openings government's case? Their case can basically be explained by, right, we'll eliminate discrimination and bias and therefore sort of lead to this meritocratic utopia, right? Which is a great idea, but it doesn't really work in practice, right? As has already been explained before, but these sort of essays actually can be used to eliminate bias, right? As my partner has already explained. So this directly clashes, and I will get into later when I explain our case once more. And then sort of the opening opposition, right, rightfully explains how these standardized tests do not necessarily test all skills, right? It's also about other skills that can be useful for evaluating whether someone is a good fit in a university, but we think our analysis is far more important since it allows for systematic change and systematic improvement of the system overall. So what is our case? Well, it's about political accountability. So while all the other sides talk about all these great things about how universities will improve, they give no mechanism whatsoever how this will actually happen. Note that under our side of the house, where there are both essays and standardized testing, right? what will happen is you can actually see the bias in the system, right? It's apparent. This idea of a meritocracy, right? We're simply doing standardized testing, and there's, you know, everybody's in their rightful place, so to speak, without taking into account factors that underlie the performance of those standardized tests that are out of individuals' control. We can do that under our side of the house, right? We can take that into account by evaluating these essays, right? Somebody might have a unique perspective because they grew up as, I don't know, they grew up in another country and came here only when they were 12 years old, right? That can be a unique benefit to both the university and the student that is not taken into account with standardized testing. So what will actually happen is, for example, you can fire somebody if their evaluation is systematically biased, right? We can do that under our side of the house, whereas under their side of the house, we simply have all these biases that influence the performance on these standardized tests, but are not taken into account by anyone afterwards. I'll take a POI from opening.
So please explain how the person with low income will prepare for an interview or a big essay, which will have the possibility to pay better tutors, and it's easier to prepare for a standardized test by yourself than for an interview.
So we think that in the interview, you can sort of understand the reasons why somebody might have done poorly under standardized testing without necessarily being stupid or not being motivated. It's pretty much factors outside someone's own control, right? So like I said, being raised in another country, right? Not having maybe full comprehension of the language that a native speaker does, right? That's already something that is not taken into account in standardized testing, but is taken into account when you have a face-to-face conversation with somebody, right? And then you see these benefits that this person can bring without necessarily taking that into account. So what we then bring in our case, right? We bring systematic change that none of the other teams have brought in this debate. We bring accountability to these universities, right? We all agree these universities are well-intended, but the other teams don't provide any metric by which to hold these universities to account, right? Under our side, you can actually have people be fired for example, being biased, and the training for these standardized tests are completely unequal between both individuals from high income versus low income households and high education versus low education households. And therefore, these are inadequate to fully evaluate someone's fitness for university, yes or no. And therefore, I'm very proud to oppose. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we will have the discussion. So I'm staying on the Zoom, but leave this breakout room.
Can we just press leave?
I don't think we have a breakout room. I think
Yeah,
it's
it's
just
not a
one room.
breakout room.
It's just one room, so we can just leave, I think. And then come back.
Or wait, is the adjudicator gone and we need to stay here?
No,
Yeah,
no,
I've sent the
we-
judges to a breakout room, and you can stay here.
Oh, okay, yeah, perfect.
Thank you, Aigerim.
Yeah, thanks everyone for the round.
Thanks, guys. Good job.
All right. All teams here, yes? Can you put in chat like OG here, things like that? Okay. Okay. So OG means it, and then we can start. Okay, cool, OG here. All right, perfect. So thank you for this debate. We had a very close call. Ultimately, the placings were the following ones. We gave the first to closing government. We gave the second to opening government. We gave the third to opening opposition, and we gave the fourth to closing opposition. Now let's start discussing the clash on top half, which we think was very close. So from the get-go, we think that there were two levels of clash that happened on the opening houses. Firstly, we see the contribution from opening government, that there are a number of factors that people take into account when you're evaluated through other methods beyond a test that can lead to systematic biases. And that the reason why this is so bad is because very often they will defer to arbitrary factors, such as the naming of people, or the types of questions that they will ask will favor people who are more privileged. And the comparison here is that tests are usually more objective metrics to prevent those types of personal biases that lead to a very poor system of accountability, and that this disadvantages most people. So from opening opposition, we think that this clash was significantly mitigated by a number of characterizations as to why is it that the decision-making of people would probably be submitted to a level of checks and accountabilities that would minimize, say, this significant biases that they're victims of. So things like that these people are often trained to not have these biases, that it is possible to complain about them, like the fact that there is some pressure on them to take into account things like the personal stories of students, things like now students have more resources to try to flag their particular backgrounds, and that these things can be taken into consideration when trying to make the calls on who should be admitted. We think that the reason why OG beats OO is because there's a particular clash that surges after that first clash, which is the following one. The reason why tests are actually better than a more holistic system of admission is that the results that will be produced are likely to be less dissimilar amongst socioeconomic groups in a world in which this is just a test. Why? Because we see specifically in the analysis that the type of questions or the type of knowledge that you need to go through this process of holistic admission is actually a knowledge that's harder to transfer. So it's actually more difficult for you as a disadvantaged kid to be able to access things like the kind of mannerisms that they expect from interviews, or what it actually means to be good in those interviews. So say, if what OO thinks is that what you have to do is to communicate your passion or to show that you have a good character, how is it that you transmit that? And the characterization that we see from OG is, well, precisely the way in which you do that is through knowing people who went to those universities, or through knowing how people who are highly educated like to talk, or knowing what are these specific likes and dislikes of people who belong to those socioeconomic groups. So the question is, if we actually think that people are more likely to perform poorly at these interviews comparatively versus tests, because we hear some reasons as to why maybe the distribution of results on tests will not be completely equal, but it is at least a type of knowledge that's more transferable, because you can just like buy one book and cram it for years. This is actually a good reason for thinking that the distribution of results that you will get will be less biased against those who don't have as much a privilege as other people. So then the question is, all right, what we hear from OO is that you have a chance to compensate for those results by talking about your background. But then it ends up being an open question that's never clearly settled of maybe you can compensate for results that are dissimilar, but would that compensation be enough? So we agree that a system of interviews rather than tests will produce more inequality in terms of the performance of most candidates. But then the question is giving the universities the flexibility to try to account for other factors sufficient to compensate that disparity of results that will be produced from interviews. And we think that ultimately it isn't really clear from opening opposition that surely it means that they can try to compensate to some degree those results. It is not clear that they will compensate to that to a sufficient degree, specifically to engage with the contention from opening government, that this will actually produce a great inequality between students who don't have the networks and social connections that people who are more privileged do have. So we think that marginally, we do believe that the world of the opening government is one world in which people have a more equitable access to entering prestigious educational institutions, precisely because the method of testing is one that's more transferable and more accessible to them. We also think that there are other claims made from the opening opposition as to why is it that tests maybe don't really capture everything that's crucial for a student. Things like it will impose demands on people that are too onerous and that are not necessarily useful for their careers. But we think that all teams from the get-go basically agree, often very explicitly, that the core of this round is how to get a more fair society, and that what they care the most about is trying to give a fair shot at people who are the most disadvantaged. So that's why we thought that the crux of those clashes, the one that we prioritized the most, was precisely that contention of how is it that this will produce results that will enfranchise or disenfranchise those who are the least well off in society. So bringing closing government. We think that there are a couple of reasons why closing government wins more decisively the opening half clash, which we think was very that was marginally won by opening government. One, what closing government gives us is a framework that explains how is it that those biases would happen, even if we grant a lot of the assumptions from opening opposition about that most people actually come to a selection process, that most selectors actually have overall good intentions. And when they explain is that there is actually an intrinsic aspect of the overwhelming amount of work that it takes to evaluate these applications, that it often leads to split-second decisions that reflect on intuitions and personal preferences that people have. And that the reason why this is so bad is that given that people from positions of privilege and from privileged groups are overrepresented in academia, it is very likely that they will defer to what they know closely. So that they would prefer a specific way of writing, that they would favor, say, a specific type of jargon, that they would favor a specific type of interest when trying to assess the passion of someone, and so on. So then the question is, and I think that this is a more decisive way of beating the contention from opening opposition, that it's not necessarily clear that these harms have to materialize only in people who possess an explicit bias. And it's actually not even clear how you would control for said biases, given that they are a structural feature of the type of very demanding work that it takes to evaluate so many applications. So we actually see a more cogent reason from CG as to why is it that an application process inevitably leads to a number of biases. The second contention that we hear from CG is that we hear more reasons as to why is it that testing is a more accessible system. One of those reasons we grant was a bit derivative from OG, but we think that there are two explicitly new mechanisms that illustrate to a more clear degree why is it that there is an asymmetry between prepping for tests and prepping for this type of interviews or essays. One, we heard about scale. So things like a holistic process often leads to personalized coaching and things like that. So you need someone who's willing to pay a lot of attention to you. But the key marginal difference here is when you're just trying to study for a number of objective questions, you can actually increase scale. So you can do things like having one classroom that's really big with lots of students who are not paying a lot of money because they're not demanding a lot of personalized work on them. They don't demand a lot of attention from the person who's coaching them, which is not true in the world of the opposition, in which you actually need a lot of individualized help. And if you need so much individualized help, then it is actually more inaccessible for those who don't have that much money, which means that probably it is far more equitable to test people on things that are not personalized to their specific needs or wants, precisely because that means that they don't have to invest money or contact a professional and things like that. We also hear a number of responses that we thought were reasonably fair about why is it that this is actually way better in terms of the perception that people have of these tests. So even if we both agree that there is still some disparities, that there are some disparities in testing, on the comparative, it is still better because people know that the results will be assessed objectively, that individualized score that they get will be their actual score, rather than that this will be the process of some mysterious assessment of people that they don't trust. So specifically, if we think that people from disenfranchised groups don't have a lot of trust in the criteria of privileged academics in the admission process, this means that it is actually more likely that they will apply if their performance depends entirely on an objective score, that they can actually track the progress that they have and that they can actually feel that they prepared for it. So this means that one of the key structural problems that most people have, which is that they don't even try to apply to these places, will be fixed. So for those two reasons, we think that they win the opening half clash more decisively, both in terms of showing why is it that these problems would persist. Yes, of course, that these problems would persist after, even if you try to control for some biases. And then secondly, why is it that this is very likely, say, to why on the comparative, we think that testing is likely to minimize disadvantages, which we think was not sufficiently explained on the OG case. Now, my camera is getting really weird, so I would like turn it off. Okay, now bring it on CO. So we think that the main new contribution from CO was mentioning why is it that structural change is actually difficult to achieve in a world in which everything that determines the admission process is just one objective score, precisely because it is more difficult to criticize that score. And so the comparison that we get is from opening opposition, we just hear that these universities might take into account different factors. But the problem is that they haven't really explained why is it that they would do it. And the mechanisms that we hear from CO is, well, it seems that bias will be easier to spot, and there is going to be a lot of pressure from donors and from different people who are sponsoring prestigious educational institutions so that they can be more diverse. The problem with this is we felt that there was not a sufficient explanation as to, one, why is it that those pressures would be so significant? So we do agree that it is a possibility that this would happen, but if the key new link here over the opening opposition team is that you will show that there is going to be an explicit increase of pressure that will lead to specific changes in the admission system, it is not particularly clear how significant that pressure is going to be. Why is it that people would actually care enough to pressure them? And also, again, there is the other problem pointed out on the opening half clash, which is even if you prove that universities will try to compensate for a disparity of results amongst different groups, the question is how much will they compensate? So plausibly say they can try to compensate a bit through affirmative action. But if we concede which is basically the clash that we think both government teams won, that a testing process produces less disparity of performance than a holistic method. Then the fact that if you use a holistic method, you can compensate to some extent for disparity does not prove that that compensation is going to be greater than the result that you would get on a testing system that produces less disparity. And that marginal difference was not particularly clear. So maybe you do get some affirmative action. It is not clear that that compensation is going to be so high that it comparatively beats the claim from the government teams that actually the disparity of results will be lower. And so we think that for that reason, it was not sufficient to beat either government teams. And it was also not a contribution that was sufficiently fleshed out to beat, so say that that extra mechanism added on the claim from opening opposition was not fleshed out in a way that was sufficiently robust to say that they beat the opening opposition with that analytical extension. So for that reason is that we reached this call, and I would like to thank all teams again and to wish you the best of luck in future rounds. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sebastian on platform.
Yeah.
Can I hit you on Facebook?
Sorry?
Can I